One of my favorite projects and clients when I was working in a design agency, graphic design agency before or right after college, was a group of people that were, it was a group of engineers. They were roadway construction traffic engineers. And they had gotten together and they were responsible for all of the extra tax dollar funds that were given over a 5 or 7 year period for all these special roadway, highway renovation projects in Santa Barbara County. So it was about a 5-year duration, hundreds of millions of dollars that were collected, and they had these major construction projects, and they needed to do a summary report for the public, for the county, on what had happened and inform everybody where their tax dollars went. So they came to us as a design agency and they said, we need to design a sort of like an annual report, but a summary report of all these projects. And it was a lot of fun because it was a large book, it had a lot of different pieces to it, and it's always fun, at least for me, to work with engineers. Because when you're working in a creative sort of profession, no offense to engineers, but engineers just love anything you do. Because it's like, oh, that's creative, you just go ahead and do it. And I'm an engineer, I'm technical, you just take care of whatever you want. So they just loved everything that we did. So we developed this whole summary report, and after months and months of design and concepts and photography and everything else we needed to do, we presented them with the final draft. They read it over, they scrutinized it in detail, like engineers should, and they gave it back to us, signed off. And we breathed a huge sigh of relief. It's done. Our job now, of course, was to prepare all the files for sending them to the printing company to have tens of thousands of these reports printed. And of course, preparing the files for something like that, it's got to be right. And it's got to be right the first time. You don't want to make a mistake. So my job was to prepare the files for sending them to the printing company. So countless phone calls, lots of tweaking back and forth, finally sent the document over to the printer. They prepared all the files. Eventually, they called me for the first press check. So I go in and they have the big press sheets lying out. The first one was of the cover and several other pages. And they had the big press sheets lying out on the table. They gave me all the instructions and everything I needed. And they said, okay, take a look, make sure everything's right before we run the whole job. And it didn't take more than a couple seconds, and I realized there's a huge problem. On the front cover, there was a whole picture. It was a nighttime photograph of one of the construction projects. And at the bottom of the picture, it was mostly black. And in that black area is where we placed the title and the logo and some other things. Their logo had a black background. The photograph was black, but they were different blacks. And it looked horrible. It just had this big gray box on one side and it looked terrible. And I knew we have to fix that. But I also knew that was going to cost a whole lot of money and delay our project. But we didn't have a choice. So I went back, I fixed the files, sent them back to the printer, and we lost about 2 days. And sent them back to the printer, they ended up printing the job just fine. I called the client, I said, here's the deal, here's what happened. They said, no big deal, we've got a couple extra days, it's not a problem. Then I went to my boss, the owner of our company, and I said, here's the story. I messed up. Here's what happened. And he said 2 things. First, he said, how's the client? And I said, they're fine. I called them, they're okay with the whole thing. Second question, how much did it cost? I said, it cost a few $1,000s. And at that point, because he is a great guy, but he has really high standards, and I knew that, I was ready to either be fired or to pay all of that money myself. I was fully ready. And it was very quiet for way too long in his office. And finally, he said, you're not going to let this happen again, right? I said, nope. He said, go. He had compassion on me, and I was grateful. God is described as compassionate. The passage that comes up again and again is that God is compassionate and merciful. overflowing in love to generations of people. This is how God wants us to understand who he is. Compassion. And if you think, compassion isn't necessarily the first thing that we usually learn to be successful in life. You know, it's not like the top trait that companies are looking for. It's not the top qualification to get into college. It's not the thing that gets us somewhere most of the time in life. And so compassion isn't the thing we normally think of. But Jesus spent a whole lot of time on this story that you just saw with the kids of healing this woman and healing another child. Jesus spent a long time talking about compassion. And if he talked this long about compassion, then surely there is something big that we need to learn about God's compassion. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to look at what God's compassion is and how big God's compassion is. So if you brought a Bible, flip open to Mark chapter 5. If you didn't, just follow along or lean into a neighbor. I couldn't print the whole passage in your bulletin because it's too long. And that's why I need you to hang with this story. The good thing is it's a story, and so it's a fun one to just listen to. But picture the story in your minds as we go through the story. And again, it is a little bit long, but we have to read the whole thing, because if we don't get the whole picture. As we're reading through this story, I want you to have something in your own minds, though. Think of your favorite sandwich. Meat and cheese, peanut butter and honey, bacon avocado, grilled cheese, club sandwich, meatball. You pick your favorite sandwich. Picture what kind of bread it's on, and picture what's inside. And what's better, the bread on the outside or the stuff on the inside? Which is better? Which is better? The stuff on the inside, for most of us at least. Keep that in mind. It's what's in the middle that really counts. Okay, let's read the story. Jesus got into the boat again and went back to the other side of the lake, where a large crowd gathered around him on the shore. Then a leader of the local synagogue, whose name was Jairus, arrived. When he saw Jesus, he fell at Jesus' feet, pleading fervently with him. "My little daughter is dying," he said. "Please come and lay your hands on her, heal her, so she can live." Jesus went with him, and all the people followed, crowding around him. A woman in the crowd had suffered for 12 years with constant bleeding. She had suffered a great deal from many doctors, and over the years she had spent everything she had to pay them. But she had gotten no better. In fact, she had gotten worse. She'd heard about Jesus, so she came up behind him through the crowd and touched his robe. For she thought to herself, "If I can touch his robe, I will be healed." Immediately the bleeding stopped, and she could feel in her body that she had been healed of her terrible condition. Jesus realized at once that healing power had gone out from him, so he turned around to the crowd and asked, "Who touched my robe?" His disciples said to him, "Look at this crowd pressing around you. How can you ask who touched me?" But he kept on looking around to see who had done it. Then the frightened woman, trembling at the realization of what had happened to her, came and fell to her knees in front of him and told him what she had done. And he said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace. Your suffering is over." While he was still speaking to her, messengers arrived from the home of Jairus, the leader of the synagogue. They told him, "Your daughter is dead. There's no use troubling this teacher now." But Jesus overheard them and said to Jairus, "Don't be afraid. Just have faith." Then Jesus stopped the crowd and wouldn't let anyone go with him, except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. When they came to the home of the synagogue leader, Jesus saw how much commotion and weeping and wailing. He went inside and asked, "Why all this commotion and weeping? The child isn't dead. She's only asleep." The crowd laughed at him, but he made them all leave, and he took the girl's father and mother and his 3 disciples into the room where the girl was lying. Holding her hand, he said this Hebrew phrase, Talitha kum, which means, "Little girl, get up." And the girl, who was 12 years old, immediately stood up and walked around. They were overwhelmed and totally amazed. Jesus gave them strict orders not to tell anyone what had happened. And then he told them to give her something to eat. Sandwich. There's one thing on the outside, and there's something in the middle. What's the outside of the story? What starts and what finishes this story? It's the whole situation with Jairus, this whole synagogue ruler, is concerned about his daughter. And Jairus is such an interesting character because Jairus isn't like every other person. I mean, Jairus actually has a name. And how many people, we can probably count on one hand, in the Gospels does Jesus talk to and even heal who we know their names? There's only a few. But we know this guy's name, which is suggesting that this guy has some rapport. This guy has some respect. This guy has some honor in his culture. People know who this guy is. He's a synagogue ruler, and he knew how to approach Jesus. He knew the recipe for how to get Jesus to respond. I mean, he came, fell at his knees, and said, basically, I respect you. I honor you. You are worth me worshiping you. He came to him and asked, would you come heal? He was fairly well off. I mean, he was a guy who was a synagogue ruler. He had this great position. He was respected and known, and he was fairly well off in his lifestyle. It makes sense that Jesus would have had compassion on him. And Jesus did have compassion on him. And that's what everybody expected would happen. But then right in the middle of this whole story that starts and ends, we have this middle thing. That's where the good stuff is. But it doesn't make a lot of sense. Because who comes and interrupts Jesus as he's on the way to do this healing that we all expect that Jesus should do? It's this woman. And let's do a little compare and contrast for a minute. Jairus has a name that we know. Do we know the woman's name? No. Jairus was fairly well off as a synagogue leader and a community leader. What did this woman have to her name? She was broke. She spent everything she had. She used up everything she owned to try to get healed. Jairus was somebody who was well known in his community. This woman was well known, but she was well known not for the right reasons. She was known because of her disease. How did Jairus approach Jesus? He came directly to Jesus. He worshiped Jesus. He asked forthrightly for Jesus to heal. How did the woman approach Jesus? Secretly. Stealth. Slip through. I don't want anybody to notice. I'm scared. Jairus approached boldly and confidently. She approached timidly. I don't know if this is going to work. For Jairus, Jesus was probably his first or second option. He said, that guy, he can heal. For this woman, Jesus was probably his last resort. She'd been through doctors. She'd been through other people to help. Nothing worked. Jesus was her last resort. And Jesus had compassion on her. And it was what we least expect was going to happen. Jairus, we expect Jesus would heal. Her, we don't expect in a million years that Jesus would heal that kind of a person. But in compassion, it doesn't make sense in certain times. Two people who couldn't be more different. Both had faith, and both received Jesus' compassion. Jesus is telling us something about how big God's compassion is. Many times in Scripture, this description of God comes up. And it's how God introduced himself to Moses long, long ago. It's printed in your bulletin. It's from Exodus. And it says, "The Lord, the God of compassion and mercy, I am slow to anger and filled with unfailing love and faithfulness. I lavish unfailing love to 1,000 generations. I forgive iniquity, rebellion, and sin." Right back in the first line, the Lord, the God of compassion and mercy. That's how God introduced himself to Moses and to God's people. Hi, my name is God. I'd like to introduce myself to you. I am compassionate. I mean, is that the first thing that we say about ourselves when we meet somebody? Hi, I'm compassionate. No, that's like the last thing we say. But that's what God wanted to be known by. He wanted to be known by, I'm compassionate. That's who I am and that's what I do. And many times throughout the Psalms, many times throughout the prophets, even into the New Testament, God is described over and over again with these kinds of phrases as compassionate and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in loving kindness. God is continually compassionate and God lives it out. God shows and proves his compassion. So why? I mean, of all the things God could be known for, why does God want to be known as compassionate? What is it about compassion that makes God want to be known as that? What's the big deal? Well, think just for a second about what compassion literally means. So for all of you English readers, Latin word group kind of people, this is your time. So think about the word compassion and split it apart because we can figure out it's calm and passion pushed together. And what does calm, what does the preposition calm probably mean? With. Yes, it means with. And then we've got passion. Passion as in the Holy Week or the week before Easter and the things that Jesus experienced during the Passion Week. That was what? What did Jesus experience during the Passion Week? Joy? Punishment. Suffering. It's with suffering. It's to suffer with somebody. Compassion, to suffer with somebody. We've said a number of times before that the Bible is God's big story of restoring our relationships with him. Because after the first page or two, it's all about God's work to fix everything. All of God's work has been to restore this relationship that we were created to have with God. And God started by giving law to people of how to obey and live. Then God gave people land to dwell in peacefully. And then God gave people prophets to remind them what this relationship was like. And still, people, us, weren't responding in the right way. So Jesus ultimately, or God said ultimately, I need to give a solution to this problem because we are not in the relationship that God made us to have with him. So God sent Jesus. And if Jesus did anything, what is it that Jesus did? He suffered with us. He had compassion on us. He lived with us. He lived all the lives that we live. He dealt with all the stuff that we deal with. And then he absorbed it all. All of the junk, all of the issues, all the challenges, all the suffering, he absorbed it. He died for it. And he had compassion on us. So how big is God's compassion? There's a book that our kids recently introduced us to, and it's this book called How Much is a Million? Anybody ever read this book? I'm loving this book. It gives a lot of comparisons, trying to capture how much is a million. And some of the things it talks about is if we were to count to 1,000,000, it would take us about 23 days.